Hello and welcome to another episode of Highway to Hill, a pro-Congress podcast about the messiest and most important branch of government. I'm Charlie Hunt, political scientist at Boise State University. I am joined, as always, by friend, colleague, political scientist, SoRelle Gaynor from the University of Virginia. Hey, SoRelle.
Hey, Charlie.
Today on Highway to Hill, we've got a lot to talk about. The Trump administration is rolling back decades of greenhouse gas emissions as the climate situation continues to worsen. How did some of Congress's newer and maybe more creative, shall we say, ways of lawmaking pave the way for presidents to wield power in this way? Plus, what on earth is Chevron deference, and why are the courts getting involved here? So we'll start with our explainer segment. First, I want to give a shout out to this article that you sent me, SoRelle, that sort of kicked us off in this direction. This really great investigative piece in the New York Times by Lisa Friedman and Maxine Joselo. The article is Trump Allies Near Total Victory in Wiping Out U.S. Climate Regulation. It's a really effective effort, I think, to sort of lay out the multi-decade sort of quest by activists on the right to essentially erase all federal climate regulation that went into place under presidents like Barack Obama and Joe Biden. This effort included in this profile is conservative leaders like Russell Vought, who listeners may know now as the director of the Office of Management and Budget, was very involved in the sort of DOGE cuts. And Jeffrey Clark, a further back name you may remember as the legal mastermind behind Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election. And before we get into some of these climate regs, I have to share one more person who was involved in this, according to the article that I need your take on, SoRelle. This is someone I hadn't heard of. This is Mandy Gunasekaran, who was Trump's chief of staff at the Environmental Protection Agency in his first term. She, in this reporting, is known in Washington as the congressional staffer who handed a snowball to then Senator James Inhofe, who was a Republican from Oklahoma. On a cold February day in 2015, Mr. Inhofe held up the snowball in the well of the Senate as evidence that the planet could not be warming dangerously, even though it was February in Washington, D.C. SoRelle, is a former congressional staffer, where does Mandy's effort here fall on dedication to the craft?
Yeah, this is like Congress lore. It's such an iconic moment. I was actually reading a book yesterday, Committees in Congress, and it referenced this moment. So I was just like, oh, it really is, it's like what we have come to expect with Congress now, doing sort of these attention-seeking moves. But I think, what's so great about this article and why I found it so interesting is it really has it all. It has, interest groups, it has courts, it has the role of the administration in creating regulations, which is what we'll talk about today, and then, sort of how Congress has taken a back seat, especially in regulatory policy. And so, of course, this was a goal in the first Trump administration to repeal or, kind of bring back these environmental regulations for, you can think of common business goals or, unleashing American energy is a phrase we hear a lot from the Trump administration. But what was really interesting about it is that they kind of took this two-pronged approach, which was one, the administrative regulations. And then after the Trump administration, after these people were out of office, so in this interim between Trump 1 and Trump 2.0, they took to the courts. So why was this week sort of the nail in the coffin, Charlie?
Yeah, so this week, they've been cultivating this effort for many years at this point, before Donald Trump probably even knew what climate change was. And it has culminated in this action on the part of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, deciding that they would do away with what is called the endangerment finding, this really pivotal finding from the Obama era that was basically underpinning all of these environmental regulations related to climate change. So in this case, under the authority provided by the Clean Air Act from the 1970s, which I know we'll talk about, Obama's EPA, so this is back in, I think, 2009, presented basically like mountains of peer-reviewed evidence around climate change, basically that saying what we all know to be true now, that greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane are doing all of the things that we know they're doing to the climate, right? Heating the earth and the oceans, melting the ice caps, causing sea level rise and droughts, and of course, increasing the danger of major storms like hurricanes, which we've, of course, seen over the last couple decades. And so this finding was then used through the Clean Air Act, which Congress passed before anybody was talking about climate change, right back in the 1970s, used this finding to underpin a bunch of new regulations around these greenhouse gas emissions. So things that the Obama administration did, like fuel efficiency standards for cars, curbing emissions from power plants and smokestacks, protecting certain areas from offshore oil drilling. And so by directing the EPA to toss out this endangerment finding, they're basically removing all the authority the federal government, the executive branch had under the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases, because this act required this kind of endangerment finding before the government could take action on something. And so they're basically taking the legs out from under all of these regulations rather than just rolling all of them back by themselves.
Yeah, they're basically taking, the legal justification they have to do these things outside of a very specific law. They're saying there isn't endangerment, basically. And so because of that, these laws that are built upon this assumption of, climate change basically are moot, are not, as we'll talk about, not going to be upheld in this post-Chevron era.
And so now, as usual, is our chance to sort of cue the Tina Turner. What's Congress got to do with it, SoRelle? Why? We've been talking about the Trump administration and Barack Obama and like the executive branch making all these regulations. Like, why are they relying on some law from 50 years ago? Why is Congress not the one making these policy decisions?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of like ability that they have, this like strength to really repeal regulations is, kind of creates this policy whiplash. So, right, how did we get here? What does this have to do with Congress? So you want to think of, you mentioned the Clean Air Act was passed first in the 70s and then reauthorized later in the 90s. You want to think of it as like a skeleton for environmental policy. So basically Congress, in passing the Clean Air Act, they set climate goals, they set goals for emissions with the goal of, obviously the first iteration, it's in the name, to make air cleaner, right? To make the environment cleaner. But they don't, in this act, they didn't specify exactly what that would look like, right? They would kind of put these benchmarks and say, like, we'd like water to be this level clean. We'd like air to be this level clean. But we're not going to tell you how to do it. We're going to let you, the experts in the EPA, do this. And they do this beyond environmental policy. They also do this through things like transportation funding, right? They'll say, like, all right, we're going to allocate X million dollars for you to update our infrastructure and bridges. But we're going to let you, the transportation department, figure out which bridges that is or which highway systems that is, right? Same with like Department of Veterans Affairs. We're going to give you the money. We're going to put forth these benchmarks, but you're going to figure out how to allocate it. And so why is Congress doing this? Well, one is that this kind of kicked off in this Clean Air Act, this 1970s, we call it the Great Broadening, when Congress just sort of had more put on its plate. We also see the rise of things like abortion kind of in the political sphere, and climate change, and expanded foreign affairs issues beyond just the kind of bread and butter of the government that they knew in sort of the like post-World War II era.
Right. So we've got same number of members of Congress. We've got the same Congress, the same president, but we've got this broadening agenda. And so they've got to sort of make some decisions about how specific they're going to get with policy and in which places, because maybe they only have so much time and like energy to deal with all of these new issues that are being sort of tossed on the table.
Yeah, and not just like new issues like, your constituents need help with this social service. Like, these are super complex issues. These are issues that require a scientist or somebody who is a doctor who knows what kind of healthcare policies or what types of birth control should be covered, for instance, right? And so it's increasing in volume and in complexity. And then you mentioned the other part, which is while these issues have expanded, the size of Congress has stayed the same, but also the amount of staff that they have to work with has been really unchanged, especially since the 2000s, right? The average rank and file member only has 18 in the House, only has 18 staffers. A quarter of those live in the district. Some of those do press. Some of those are kind of the HR department of the office. So you only have a handful of staffers that are expected to be policy experts. And so, they don't have that sort of in-house knowledge. And you've written a lot about the turnover in staff offices too, Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, you've got, and it's not hard to see why you see a lot of turnover in the legislative branch. Number one, because to your point, all these new issues, right? And this is still happening today, right? Think about all of the new AI policy we need to make in Congress and people who are still trying to develop their expertise in this area. And you've got congressional staffers, so, legislative correspondents or legislative assistants who are, they have their issue profiles and they are dealing with 3 or 4 or 10 just issues from way across the table. They have not, these are really capable people and they do the best they can, but they are not, they did not go get graduate degrees in all of these different issues, right? They are sort of doing what they can and cobbling things together, and in many cases relying on interest groups and lobbyists who are providing them with information. And so it's a really demanding job, and they're not getting, my opinion, not getting paid enough, right? They are way underpaid compared to a lot of these lobbyists on K Street. And so it is no wonder that we lose a lot of the sort of best and the brightest congressional staffers to lobbying firms and interest groups. It's sort of hard to blame them for wanting to make more money and have a reasonable sort of issue profile that they can deal with and then develop that expertise over the long term.
Yeah, and even if you do get lucky and you're a staffer and you get assigned to an area that you really care about, like AI policy, that's usually not your only portfolio, right? You have to deal with veterans affairs or something else. So you're limited in time. But then you compare that to the executive branch, where you have long-term experienced, well-educated staffers. I mean, even post-Doge cuts, there's still far and away far more people in the executive branch. And so let's say an issue like the environment. You don't just have a scientist, you also have an economist who understands this issue. And you have a dedicated, somebody who maybe has worked in sort of a national park or something like that, somebody with these real world experiences. So there's just so much depth within the administration that it is sort of you could argue a smart approach to say, all right, these are our goals and we're going to let people who do have the expertise to figure it out. The problem is, of course, is that we didn't elect these people, right? We didn't elect people who work in the executive branch. And so it does kind of take away from this representative power and, as we're talking about today, makes it vulnerable to this sort of policy whiplash that the Trump administration and other administrations prior to it have taken advantage of.
Right. You're getting, every new administration, especially in recent years, we are seeing record numbers of new executive orders being made on day one, and then the rescission of the previous president's executive orders. So you've got, Donald Trump coming in 2017 and rescinding a bunch of, administrative stuff Obama had done over the previous 8 years. Biden did the same thing right back to Trump. And then especially, this 2025 was in a league of its own in terms of executive orders and actions that, totally dismantled so much of what the Biden administration accomplished. And so, first of all, this is hard to keep track of from a policy perspective, the impact on the economy, on businesses, trying to keep up with what regulations they're supposed to be a part of. Number one, it is going way out in left or right field, depending on the administration you've got in there. And number two, it is creating all this uncertainty that is making it difficult to plan in the long term for policy implications like these. And that's especially important for something like climate change, which is like the ultimate long-term issue that requires like long-term policy planning and is not something that can either be like fixed or completely broken with one regulation. Like it requires this long-term thinking. And instead we're just like bolting back and forth between the two extremes every 4 or 8 years. And like for a policy like this, that's just not the ideal way to do things. All right, so let's go to some. We got a few different, I think, vocab terms, SoRelle, that we've got to talk about here because we've spent a lot of time talking about struggle between the legislative and executive branch. But what we haven't talked about so much yet are the courts, the third branch of the federal government, and what role they play. And they've had a number of recent actions and opinions that I think can actually tell us a lot about how Congress's role has changed. Where do you want to start with this? Like, what are some things we should know about, from sort of a jurisprudence standpoint, what Congress can do and what Congress should do in policy situations like these?
Well, I love to start with what the Constitution says about this. So in Article
Ideal.
1, Congress alone has the ability to create legislation. It's non-delegation doctrine. This cannot be delegated to other branches of government. So a lot of the more recent cases about administrative policy kind of hinge on this, which is it's the only branch that has this ability to create a law. Did it delegate this to another branch, right? So that's sort of a first constitutional question that the courts will consider. This has since sort of evolved into, if you read a court ruling, they're never inclined to make a super blanket statement. What they like to do is to make these sort of rules that future cases and lower courts or other court systems can use in deciding cases. So in answering this non-delegation doctrine question, can an agency create a regulation, that kind of acts like a law? They've developed this major questions doctrine. If an agency is deciding an issue of vast economic and political significance, it must have statutory legal authority from Congress to do this. So the Clean Air Act delegated some authority to create climate rules. Where the issues come up is, are the rules that the EPA or some other agency is creating, do they have a vast economic or political significance on them? This, while helpful, is going to have, there's a lot of room for interpretation, right? What does vast economic and political significance mean?
Pretty subjective to me. Like, is this just judges deciding what is vast or like what?
Yes.
It seems like it could leave some room for tricky business.
And it definitely does. And, the Trump allies who have been working on this issue for many years now, they took this issue of this major questions issue and the kind of challenges that they felt with the EPA. They took this to the courts earlier under a liberal-leaning court, and they were shot down. And they said, this is my goal to get this repealed. I'm going to try again.
Yeah, so this is where we briefly skated past the term Chevron deference in our first segment, and this is where this comes into play. This was a ruling in 2024 where the Supreme Court overruled their own decision back in the 80s, and that 80s decision was Chevron versus Natural Resources Defense Council, the NRDC. And this gave rise to what we call the Chevron doctrine. So under this issue, under Chevron, if Congress has not directly addressed a question of this sort of magnitude in a legal policy dispute, then the courts basically defaulted back to the federal agency's interpretation of that statute, as long as it was, quote, reasonable. Again, we're being subjective here, I guess. But the basis of Chevron was like, if Congress is vague, if they haven't directly addressed the question, then federal agencies like the EPA, interpreting the Clean Air Act, have a lot of wiggle room to do what they want there, as long as it's not like directly contradicting the law that's at its basis. But in 2024, the newer, sort of more conservative court overturned Chevron in a 6-3 vote, right? And so in overturning Chevron, and this was it was a couple different cases, but the one that got a lot of attention was the Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, the Department of Commerce. This was in 2024. And in contradiction of Chevron, the court basically said that rather than giving the agency the leeway to sort of interpret congressional statutes in if they're having ambiguity about it, as in the Clean Air Act, now the courts can interpret, like they are the ones to interpret the law, the intention, and sort of the regulatory scope, and this fully overturned Chevron. And so it basically transfers this power from these federal agencies to the courts.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because how the Chevron doctrine was originally used under the Reagan administration was actually to give the administration more power to create these regulations. And so it's interesting that the Trump administration, or at least conservatives, who are generally against environmental regulations and other regulations, this is not just applied to the EPA now that the court has made this ruling. It's interesting that their default is, you know what, I'd rather just have none, right? Rather than having the power to create my own regulations, I'd rather you just strip the ability. And by removing that legal authority, you're able to then kind of go back and get rid of rules that are already on the book. So it's a very blunt measurement. But as we've seen, repealing this major EPA rule, it's very effective if, getting rid of regulations is your ultimate goal.
Right. And sort of the elephant in the room here is that everybody involved here, right? The administration knows, Congress certainly knows, and even the courts know, even if they would never say it, is Congress is so gridlocked and broken that they are never going to make new policy, not in any kind of real way that we are saying that they should be in these cases, right? This is where it all comes back to Congress because, isn't it couldn't all of this be solved if Congress was just more clear about what it wanted and its legislative actions, right? But they can't because we have all this gridlock and climate denial and all of this other stuff that makes making some new version, new, more specific version of the Clean Air Act, call it the Green New Deal, call it whatever you want, basically impossible unless you only do it through fiscal policy where you're just spending money. And so you can do it through reconciliation, not have to get through the filibuster. But we all know that there's no Green New Deal, new version of the Clean Air Act that's going to get passed with 60 votes in the Senate, right? So it's all just kind of moot.
Yeah, and I think that the Trump administration is banking on that reality that, because Congress cannot come to agreement, that's part of it, but also they don't have the capacity to come up with this detailed policy, these detailed regulations that by removing them from the books entirely, it again is kind of the Wild West when it comes to energy and the environment in this case, but you can think of it in other sectors as well.
All right, let's go to the Gavel Drop. Before SoRelle and I adjourn, we'll share a couple more stories unrelated to what we've been talking about that we wanted to sort of get in your ear holes before we get out the door. So I'll start us off this week. And this was a really interesting vote the other day. This was a vote in the House on a rule that would have framed the debate for blocking floor votes to end tariffs. So there's lots of double negatives kind of happening there. So Trump administration has had all these tariffs. They have been very unpopular, including with a lot of Republicans in Congress. And this was a resolution that the House was putting forward. All it would have done was basically block Congress from talking about or debating these tariffs for a 3-month period, basically until after the courts could weigh in on them later, probably in June. And a few Republicans sided with the Democrats in rejecting the vote that would have set the rule on that. So basically doing away with this push altogether. You had Kevin Kiley of California, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, who SoRelle's going to talk about, I think, in a second, and then Don Bacon of Nebraska. They stuck with Democrats. And this sort of points, SoRelle, to this larger issue that Speaker Johnson is facing, where on rules like these, on things like discharge petitions, where rank and file members are bringing things to the floor over leadership's objections and over Donald Trump's objections. Forcing Johnson to pull legislation from the floor. Josh Huter at the Government Affairs Institute at Georgetown wrote about this and basically said that Johnson has set all manner of records during his speakership for basically the most epic fails as a sort of a driver of these legislative vehicles. Like, he has a really hard job, but there's definitely also some potential incompetence here. But like, do you have any sympathy here?
I mean, no, not really. But I mean, it's really incredible. Like, we both teach classes in Congress. It's honestly exciting when this stuff happens because it's like it becomes a little footnote in a textbook. It's that rare. These rules not passing isn't just, to me, it doesn't just say that there's maybe bad party management going on, because it is hard to manage a party. There also seems to be some sort of like a level of disrespect, right? So this quote from Massey is great. When asked if there's any way Johnson could get his vote, he said, "The speaker is going to do whatever the president wants. He has to." Like, I mean, and that's,
Not
Mike
wrong.
Johnson is speaker because Trump endorsed him in the speaker race. And so, and Massey knows that he's hamstrung in that way.
All we have to do is think about the conditions under which Johnson arose to the speakership anyway. First of all, nobody else wanted it after Kevin McCarthy got like unceremoniously booted just a couple of years ago. And even he could barely get these votes. Johnson was not like the next guy, the next like leader in waiting. He hadn't been in Congress for that long. He's pretty, like, as a rank and file, he was pretty far to the right. Like, he was one of the chief election denying folks in 2020. And so he's not the person you would have expected to end up here anyway. And it's just, where he'll be a main character on this podcast, at least as long as he's still the speaker. But it's just interesting to see these kind of failures play out again and again.
Yeah, and it goes back to our earlier point about capacity. Like, it's not just that he's ideologically extreme. Like, not only is he green at the job, but I would imagine a lot of his staff is too, unless they hung around from Kevin McCarthy's tenure, which why would you, right? So much of Congress is about building relations, especially when you're doing things like whipping votes. And if you don't have staff to staff level relations, that makes it that much harder.
So, SoRelle, you mentioned Thomas Massey, and we mentioned him as part of this group, but he's been all over the place this week, including with regard, of course, to the Epstein files. What's your update on that?
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the Epstein files again, but this is more of like hey, Congress did something good. So Representative Massey, who we spoke about, as well as Ro Khanna, a Democrat from California, they were the leaders of this Epstein Transparency Act that, as Charlie had just mentioned, was passed via discharge petition, which means it goes over the speaker and the rules committee and is allowed to have a vote on the floor because enough members have signed a petition to get it to the floor. So he was spearheading that. Part of that Transparency Act was that, of course, the Epstein files were released. And anyone who's been on the internet at all in the past month knows that, or several months, knows that that's not happening, right? They've only released a fraction of the documents. They're heavily redacted. And so Massey and Khanna engaged in like classic oversight, which is they sent a letter to the DOJ asking that they can view the unredacted files.
They themselves, the members.
Yes, the members could view them. And so, sending a letter to an agency is another really good example of oversight. It's similar to a hearing or something like that, but you're asking an agency to update you on a specific policy or allow you to view certain files or give you a report update, right? So they sent this letter. Democrats on the Oversight Committee, led by Ranking Member Jamie Raskin from Maryland, also sent a similar letter asking for Democrats on the Oversight Committee to view the files. And somewhat surprisingly, the DOJ obliged. They didn't make it easy. They have to go to the DOJ. They have to view the files on the computer. DOJ staffers are apparently watching what they're searching and taking note of the terms they're searching. But they are getting access to these unredacted files. And so with that, we're starting to find out like who some of these redacted names are. And, it's not perfect, but I think it's a start. And I think this tweet from Rep. Rob Khanna from the Democrat from California says it great. When Congress pushes back, Congress can prevail. At Thomas Massey and I have always believed that Congress must not be a doormat, not when it comes to the Epstein files. I mean, I don't think they should be a doormat on anything, but right. Certainly this issue, I can agree with that. And so it's like, oh, there you go.
It's so funny because you mentioned like writing a letter, and I can imagine a listener being like, "Oh, they wrote a letter, big deal." Like, great, a strongly worded letter. But this is important for two reasons. Number one, like writing this letter gets it on the record that you made a request,
yes.
And then the receiving party, in this case the DOJ, can be held accountable if they don't respond in a timely fashion. And that is then evidence for future oversight. And number two, they followed up. Like they went and made sure that members of Congress were able to do this. And it's especially sort of heartening to see that, in light of this bonkers hearing with Pam Bondi the other day, where it was just the level of like unprofessionalism was incredible. It was a total like you said, show for TV. But these two members have like been on this. They've stayed on it for, years at this point, and in a bipartisan fashion. And it does send a pretty strong signal. So I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, and I think it shows, the members who have gone to view the Epstein files, which again, is not easy. You have to go to the DOJ and schedule a meeting and all of this. A lot of them are doing it because their constituents are demanding they do it, right? That, like, sure, there's probably some personal interest and personal ideological motivations, but constituents, people are upset about this, and this is something that members can do. And the members who are allowed to see the files seems to be expanding every week as they kind of work through the kinks. So it is good. Oversight is good. Yeah.
Go Congress.
Yes.
On that note, that'll do it for us this week on Highway to Hill. Thanks for joining us. Thanks, SoRelle, as always. And
thank you.
We will see y'all next Friday.